there, knitters! Welcome to episode 30 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about modifying V-neck necklines. So I wore this t-shirt on purpose. We're going to be looking at top-down or bottom-up modifications on a pullover style garment. This similar technique would be used for cardigans or vests. I guess vests would be worked in the round. So basically cardigans, but we're not necessarily going to be looking at cardigans specifically today. So if you have questions about that, definitely let me know in the comments below. So first we're going to take a look at sort of the requirements or the baseline of V-neck shaping, and then we're going to talk about how you can modify it to make it wider or narrower or shallower or deeper. So get those screenshot fingers ready because we've got lots of slides today to go through, and let's just dive right in. V-neck shaping can be worked from the top down, utilizing increases to shape the neckline, or from the bottom up, utilizing decreases to shape the neckline. If you're working from the top down, stitches are generally cast on or picked up and knit from the back shoulder stitches and worked separately, increasing stitches at each edge of the neckline. The two sides are worked separately, but eventually the total stitches that you cast on will meet in the middle to create the full width of the front of the sweater or vest. If you're working from the bottom up, the front is divided in half, where half of the stitches are placed on hold, and decreases are shaped up the side of the neckline until the target shoulder width is reached. So let's take a look at sort of what we would consider a standard V-neck shaping. When I say standard, I mean that you are increasing or decreasing at the neckline edge every other row so you get a nice consistent shape to your neckline. The number of stitches you increase or decrease along the neckline edge, depending on the direction that you're working it, are directly proportional to the number of stitches that create the back width of your neckline. So for example, if the back neckline of your sweater is about 6 1/4 inches or 15.9 centimeters wide, assuming that your gauge is 18 stitches over 4 inches, that means your back neck is going to be 28 stitches wide. So the direct correlation to that is that each edge of your neckline needs to either increase or decrease 14 stitches, or half of the total stitches that you will need to make the back neckline width. So let's use this example as our baseline. Our gauge will be 18 stitches and 24 rows equals 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Let's say that the pattern that you're working from, and this is an imaginary pattern, calls for you to work 14 stitches decreased along each edge, and the shaping will be worked every other row. Basically the standard shaping rate that I talked about just a moment ago. This means that the total number of rows that you work is 28 because we're working 14 increase or decrease rows every other row. The row in between will be a knit even row or a row without any shaping. At our row gauge of 24 rows equals 4 inches or 10 centimeters, this 28 rows works out to be about 4.65 inches or 11.9 centimeters in depth. So that's our baseline. We're going to have a 28 stitch wide back neckline and a 28 row deep neckline. Let's say we want to maintain the depth of the neckline, so still 28 rows, but we want to make the neckline wider. To do this, we're going to adjust the rate of shaping. We'll utilize every row shaping, meaning we will increase or decrease on one row interval or every row, as well as every other row shaping, sort of the standard where we increase or decrease every 2 rows. So looking at this second example in the center of the screen, let's say that instead of a 6.25 inch wide or 28 inch wide neckline, we want a target neckline width of about 7 inches or 17.8 centimeters. At our gauge, this converts to be 32 stitches. To determine the rate of shaping we would need to work, we will divide the total number of rows we need to achieve the depth, which is still 28 rows, by the number of stitches we need to decrease or decrease per side. This goes back to the relationship between the total back neck width relating to the number of stitches we decrease on each side. So in this case, because our back neck width is 32 stitches, we will increase or decrease 16 stitches each side. So that means we're going to divide our 28 total rows by our 16 stitches to decrease on each side, and we get 1.75. Since we can't work shaping at a 1.75 row interval, we need to round up the interval to be 2 row shaping or round it down to be 1 row shaping. When I do the math on this, it works out to 12 repeats of 2 row shaping to use up 24 of our total 28 rows, and then 4 repeats of 1 row shaping to use up the remaining 4 rows of the 28 target rows to achieve our depth. We're going to work the shorter interval of increases at the bottom of the neckline and then taper up to the 2 row increases as we get closer to the shoulders, so we have a nice gentle slope as we get close to the neckline. Now let's say we want to maintain the depth of the neckline, so still 28 rows, but we want to make the neckline narrower than our original 28 stitches. There's 2 options available for this modification. So let's look at option 1, what I consider the easier method. Looking at this third example on the right, let's say that instead of a 6.25 inch wide neckline, or 28 stitches, we want a target neckline width of about 5.25 inches or 13.5 centimeters, which converts to be 24 stitches. Since we're working fewer decreases than the pattern calls for, but we want to knit the same depth of neckline, we will work the 12 repeats of the 2 row decrease, remember half the back of the width of the neck, to make sure we've decreased all 12 stitches for one side, and therefore we use 24 rows, and we've decreased all of our stitches. To make up that 4 row difference to get our 28 row depth neckline, we will knit 4 rows even, meaning they will have no increases or decreases, and you'll get a straight vertical edge leading up to your shoulder. For option 2, we want to take the same consideration. We want to maintain the 28 row depth and make the neckline narrower, but we don't want to have a vertical edge at the shoulder. So we'll do something very similar to the wide option in the center of the screen. To determine the rate of shaping we need to work, we will divide the total number of rows we need to achieve the depth, still our 28 rows, by the number of stitches we need to increase or decrease per side, which is 12, half of 24, and we get 2.33 repeating. Since, just like before, we can't work shaping at a 2.33 row interval, we need to round up the interval to 3 row shaping or round down to 2 row shaping. So we will work 8 repeats of the 2 row shaping at the bottom of the V-neck to use up 16 of our 28 total rows. And then we'll work 4 repeats of the 3 row shaping at the top of the V-neck to use up the remaining 12 rows of the 28 total rows to achieve our target depth. So now let's take a look at how to plan your projects when you're going to be making modifications to your neckline, and we'll look at both top-down versions as well as bottom-up versions. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about adjusting the depth of our necklines. We'll come to that after we talk about planning your sweater. Working V-neck shaping from the top down is arguably a little bit easier than working from the bottom up. You're going to work your interval of neckline shaping per our previous exercises until the total number of stitches you need to increase on each side of the neckline are reached. At that point, the 2 front widths will be half the total width of the sweater, so you'll simply join the 2 fronts together and begin to work the entire width of the front of the yoke. You'll determine the target depth of your V-neck based on your row gauge and figure out the intervals of shaping based on the rates of shaping we've already discussed. So once you've reached that target depth and your target stitch counts, you'll be left to work the remainder of the depth for the armhole or yoke as per the pattern. Now, if we're going to look at a bottom-up sweater, There's definitely a little bit more planning that goes into it because we have to make sure we stop at the right point. So let's take a look at what that looks like. To begin, let's assume that we're working the body in the round. So you'll be knitting it in the round up to the divide for the armholes, at which point we're going to start working flat. And this is where our row gauge becomes really critical. You need to determine how many rows you need to achieve your target full yoke depth and the target V-neck depth. Let's continue with the stitch and row gauge we used on our previous examples. We'll say that the total depth of the yoke from the underarm, the bottom dashed line, to the high point shoulder, the highest point at the edge of your neckline, is 8 inches. At our row gauge, that works out to be 48 rows. Let's also continue with our target V-neck depth of about 4.65 inches or 28 rows. We'll subtract our target V-neck depth, the 28 rows, from our total target yoke depth, which is 48 rows, to determine our stopping point of knitting for the entire width of the yoke. In this case, we'll be knitting 20 rows even from the separation of the underarm to the bottom of the neckline. And that's when we will start to divide for the left and right halves of the yoke. After working our 20 rows of the yoke, we'll work the left front of the sweater first. You'll work half of your total front stitches, including your neckline edge decrease on the left front of your sweater. You'll end at where we have the red circle at the bottom of the V-neck, and this will be the halfway point of your sweater front. You'll place all of the live stitches to the left of this red circle onto a stitch holder, a spare needle, or waste yarn while you complete the left front of the sweater. Those stitches on hold will eventually make up the right front of your sweater. You'll work all of the V-neck shaping over the remaining 28 rows of the left front so that when you're done, your entire front yoke at the high point shoulder is 48 rows tall. If the back of your yoke is already done, you can seam the shoulder to the back, or you can place these left front shoulder stitches on hold and leave it to be seamed to the back later. Once the left is done, you'll place the stitches of the right front back onto your working needle and mirror all the shaping you just did so that each side of the neckline is the same depth. So when it comes to planning your total yoke depth for your sweater, so you know where to stop working flat and start your base of your neckline, you have to take into account any short row shaping that may be in your garment up to the high point shoulder. There's generally, not always, but generally short row shaping that allows your armhole edge to be a little bit lower than your high point shoulder or the highest point of your cardigan or sweater or collar. Let's just say collar. So when you see a target depth, make sure you take into account any short row shaping that you're going to be doing here, because that will also add depth to your V-neck. So when we go back to the example we just talked about, let's imagine that the target yoke depth is from the underarm to that high point shoulder. Your armhole depth might be shorter, like say 7 inches. So you have a 1 inch differential. You're looking for the longest possible depth of your yoke to figure out your stopping point to begin your neckline shaping. Okay, so before we sign off for today, let's take a look at adjusting the depth of a V-neck rather than adjusting the width of a V-neck. I'm going to use the same baseline example that we established earlier on the left side of the screen so we can visually see what happens when we have more vertical length to work with. We'll have 2 options for neckline shaping when we add length and 2 neckline shaping options for when we subtract length. And between the 2 options, they're going to look pretty familiar. So for a longer neckline, the simplest option is definitely option 1. It's going to look an awful lot like option 1 from the making the neckline narrower. Because you've got more length over which to work your decreases or increases, you can simply work them at the standard 2-row shaping, and then once all of the stitches you need to increase or decrease out will be done, you can simply knit even to the target length. For a bottom-up version, you'll need to start your V-neck shaping sooner than the designer calls for. So for example, if we go back to our 8-inch example where we worked 20 rows even before we began the neckline shaping, instead you might only knit 10 rows before you divide for your V-neck shaping to make sure the neckline is deeper. Now let's look at option 2. Similar to option 1, if you're working top down, you work the shallower shaping, for example, the 3-row intervals at the top of the neckline, working the required number per the breakdown below the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen. Once the 3-row intervals are complete, then you'll begin the increases at the standard 2-row shaping until all increases have been worked. This is very similar to option 1. We're just creating a curved edge rather than having straight edges. For a bottom-up version, just like option 1, you'll need to start your V-neck shaping sooner than the designer calls for. So you'll divide your yoke at the length differential that you want to add, and then begin your shaping. You'll work the 2-row intervals at the bottom of the V-neck and the 3-row interval shaping at the top of the neckline for the smoothest shape. So a longer yoke than the pattern calls for is a lot easier than making it wider or narrower, and you'll find it's actually even easier than making it shorter, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Because your total number of stitches that you increase or decrease to shape the neckline doesn't change, you just have more space over which to work it. So you just need to space out the increases so you get a nice smooth curve, or simply work it using the same 2-row interval that the pattern likely calls for, and then just knit it flat up to your shoulder edge. So now let's take a look at what we're going to do if we need to shorten the V-neck but maintain the back neck width. So much like the longer neckline version, we are going to have 2 options for shaping a shorter neckline. The first option will be the simpler option, and the second option will be slightly more tailored or finessed. For option 1, if you're working from the top down, you will work even, meaning no decreases, for the required length per the below graphic. Once you have worked the required number of rows, you will transition to an every row or 1-row interval of shaping to make sure you reach the target length of your neckline with all of the shaping complete. So your angle of increase is going to be a lot steeper than the baseline example on the left side in order to make up the total number of stitches that we need to cast on. For a bottom-up version, you will start your V-neck shaping after the length that the designer calls for. For example, if you want your V-neck to be 1.5 inches shorter than the pattern calls for, you will add that length to the existing length the designer calls for. To give you a quick example, if the designer says to knit 1 inch even before you start any V-neck shaping, but you're removing 1.5 inches from the depth of your V-neck neckline, you will knit to 2.5 inches, which is 1 inch that the designer called for, plus the 1.5 inches that you're removing from the neckline before you start any neckline shaping. You will work your shaping at a 1-row interval to achieve all of the decreases you need to, and then you will knit even with no more decreases until you reach your target yoke depth. For option 2, it's going to look again very similar to option 1, but just a little bit more finessed. So if you're working from the top down, you will work the shallower shaping, meaning the 2-row interval at the top of the neckline, working the required number per the breakdown below the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen. Once the 2-row intervals are complete, you will then begin the increases at 1-row intervals until all of your increases have been worked. For a bottom-up version, just like option 1, you will need to start your V-neck shaping after knitting longer than the designer calls for. So you will divide your yoke at the length differential you want to remove from your neckline and then begin your shaping. You will work the 1-row or the steeper intervals at the bottom of the neckline and the 2-row intervals or the shallower shaping at the top of the neckline as you get towards the shoulders for the smoothest shape. And that's where we're going to leave it today, my friends. I know that was a lot of math, I hope that you found the graphics useful. I was trying not to be too repetitive, but I wanted to make sure that we covered any of the options you might need to consider. I hope you were able to screenshot what I was sharing with you, because a lot of the math that would have been repetitive is repeated on each of those graphics, so you can use it to apply to your project. So next week, we are going to have a bit more of a discussion. This was a write-in topic I received way back, I want to say in February. And it's not that I didn't want to get to it sooner. It was just a topic that was less technical, but still really valuable. So next week, we're going to have a conversation about DPNs, or double pointed needles. We're going to talk about how to best set them up for your projects, why you might want to use them or why you might not want to use them. As always, please remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please tell a friend. The more people we know, the more people we can help on their knitting journey. Thank you so much for being here with me this week, my friends. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and happy knitting.